In a previous video, I took a look at that Windows RG mod. Today's video has absolutely nothing to do with that mod, but instead we're going to be focusing on the computer used in that video. If you didn't see that video, this thing is what I like to call the eMachines monstrosity. This entire computer is probably a video of its own, but briefly, this was an AMD Sempron based thing from about late 2005, early 2006. It was already pretty junky to begin with, but then the original motherboard stopped working. A lot of the original parts were replaced on this computer anyway. It really was just kind of pieced together. This thing ended up being rebuilt with the cheapest eMachines motherboard I could find at the time, which turned out to be this Socket 370 board out of an eMachines T1116 that I bought for like 15 or 20 bucks. This board also came with a Tualatin-based Intel Celeron processor clocked at 1.2 GHz. And I don't actually have any other Socket 370 processors, so that's what it stayed on. I don't know if I'd say this board is crap, but it's certainly low end and it's missing a lot of features. It was also paired with 384 megabytes of PC133 SD RAM, and I had an old ATI Rage XL PCI graphics card laying around that I decided to try in here, though honestly I don't even know if it's any better than the integrated graphics. I also bought a couple of what turned out to be very crappy optical drives for this computer. I mean, this thing doesn't really get used hardly ever. In fact, it doesn't even have a proper hard drive in it because it gets turned on like maybe a couple times a year. This computer really was just meant to be a cheap and basic build so that I could use some spare parts laying around and so that this case wouldn't just be wasted. But there was something else with the original computer that I hadn't attempted to use again so far. I had these old discs laying around that contained recovery images for not the exact computer, but rather images for a similar computer that a friend gave me. But for the purposes of this video, let's say it was the media for the original configuration of this computer. I was kind of curious what might happen if I tried to use these discs on this computer now. In theory, this is doable because eMachines, in an attempt to probably save money, didn't bother with any software lockouts on any of their recovery media images, at least during this time period. So, for instance, if you have an eMachines recovery disk, you can just boot it on anything, even a virtual machine, and it will just let you use it on anything like there's no problem, which for any OEM recovery disk is unusually easy. This was exactly how I was able to restore this computer using media for a completely different system. This would have originally been a Windows XP computer, but a much older Windows XP computer. The software on these disks was designed for a 2005-ish machine, and these launch Windows XP systems, let's say, started struggling more and more as Windows XP got more and more updates. It could be more challenging than one might assume. So it was time to see just what would happen. Before I had even done anything, I already ran into a problem. I already mentioned that the optical drives in this computer suck, and I forgot the DVD-ROM drive in this computer is totally non-functional. But this computer only boots from master devices, so I already had to swap around the drives before I could even do anything. It's also a little hard to see what's going on because the initial recovery process can't output to my capture card at all because it's not a 4:3 resolution, but as I had suspected, it was able to boot just fine on this hardware. However, not much more happened after that. It was at this please wait screen and there was no activity from either the hard drive or the CD. So at this point, I thought this was maybe over before it had even started. However, about 3 minutes later, it eventually adjusted the resolution, so it wasn't done yet, and about 3 minutes after that, the recovery program finally opened. So for those keeping track, it took 8 minutes for the recovery program to start actually doing stuff. Now, once it actually started copying stuff from the disk to the hard drive, it didn't take too long. I'd say roughly 15 minutes or so. I was a little bit slow to swap the disks in, and the recovery itself took about 8 minutes. So in total, let's say 20 to 25 minutes, considering it had to copy a bunch of stuff from disks to the drive. is really not that bad at all. But after that, it was once again back to things being extremely slow. Particularly, it was stuck on this factory patch thing for a long time. All in all, this initial recovery process was almost an hour in total. Yeah, it wasn't exactly working at speed, but we weren't done with that either. It had to do a second phase of setup where it was actually installing everything. And this is really where things started going pretty downhill. It started doing its software setup as you would expect, but about halfway through it attempted to install the Realtek audio driver for the original motherboard, and it did not like this at all. The computer blue screened, rebooted, and I was kind of hoping it would just pick back up where it had left off. I mean, this time we have a higher display resolution, but it was clear to me this thing was all screwed up because now it was attempting to do a separate phase of software setup that normally would not occur in this mode. It would usually be on the desktop. It was clear to me that it was not exactly designed to be suddenly rebooted like that, and although it seemed like it was sort of picking itself back up, it eventually attempted to install that same driver again, and the results were exactly the same. This ended up being so slow that I wasn't in the room when any of this happened, and I only eventually noticed that Norton Antivirus had actually stopped the entire process because it didn't like one of the computer's own scripts that the recovery program used. I was only briefly looking at it, and it seemed like it was progressing anyway, so I just kind of let it be. But it rebooted like 4 or 5 times because of that failed driver, and it was just throwing all kinds of weird errors and stuff. It was very clear it was not happy. Although it did complete and we got to a desktop, just kind of a screwed up one. There was no out-of-box experience, which was pretty unusual, and Norton Antivirus was completely screwed up, and I could tell that it had not properly installed like half of the things that were supposed to be on this disk. And some of the things that were there clearly weren't happy. So then I decided to do something I probably shouldn't have. I decided to run it a second time. This time entirely off the hard drive, so the initial recovery process didn't take very long. This turned out to be a big mistake, as not only did it have the exact same problem with that driver again, but this time it just never completed the second part of setup at all. It kept getting stuck in this, effectively a loop, where it was trying to install the chipset drivers for the original motherboard this media was meant for, failing to do so, and then either just doing nothing or eventually crashing and rebooting before trying to install those chipset drivers again. I ended up letting it sit here for about 5 hours, and it never made any progress. I didn't really have an obvious answer why, other than clearly this media or the drivers in it just had some kind of conflict with this board that it just didn't like. I was kind of just out of options because it didn't seem to want to load on this computer at all. So I decided it was time to cheat a little. I ended up taking the hard drive out of the computer and plugging it into my bench machine and running this process in a virtual machine. I already had that Windows RG VM after all, so it was pretty easy to get set up. At the very least, you can actually see what's kind of happening this time, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it loaded a whole lot quicker, and when I got back to the same part of setup with that Realtek driver, it just ignored it and carried on its way, which is what I had hoped would happen on the computer. In fact, it completed with no problems at all. All of the initial software installed, the computer rebooted into the desktop where it was then supposed to do another round of software setup. So you can see how this process was kind of supposed to work. This was quicker than it being on the computer, but running a slow hard drive over USB, it still took quite some time. But when I came back later, it was at the out-of-box experience like nothing had happened. So all it took was running the media on a different computer. So, I mean, kind of ended up defeating the point, but either way, it made it to the desktop on the virtual machine, so now it was time to plug it into the computer. And I hadn't even gotten to the desktop yet before we were already having problems. I mean, it booted just fine after that. It spent a long time trying to do all the hardware setup. Fortunately, because this is so old, all of the hardware is already built in out of the box, even without any updates. It should be worth noting this install of Windows is already on Service Pack 2 of Windows XP, and there's already some pretty noticeable slowdown. I mean, just this driver installation phase took almost 10 minutes. To help it out, when all of the hardware setup was done, I uninstalled any antivirus solution that was present on here, and the reason I can't say one specific antivirus is because this actually has both Norton and McAfee preloaded on it, and I uninstalled both. This Windows install mostly has just third-party software on it, you know, kind of the usual things like AOL 9, it's got Power DVD, Microsoft Works, and Money. Nothing really super spectacular. I mean, it's an eMachines Windows install. And again, while it was kinda slow, it was doing it. I'm sure it helps that this got the upgrade to 384 megs of RAM, since this actually was originally only at 128 megs of RAM, and I have to imagine this would have been even more miserable with that. I did also get a network solution going on here, and I decided, perhaps rather stupidly, to try fully updating the computer, including updating it to Service Pack 3 and all of the subsequent updates up until 2014. Mostly just because I wanted to see if I could make it even slower that way. Unsurprisingly, this took so long to do, it was actually a several day long operation to get this thing fully updated, but it hung on with no problems at all. So is this really the worst Windows XP restore experience, or whatever other clickbaity title I used on this video? I mean, let's put it this way, it's not good. If it has to be run on another computer for it to actually work at all, it's not a good start. And it is really slow, even by Windows XP standards. There isn't really one singular culprit to that. I mean, the processor being so old isn't going to help. Also, not having a lot of RAM available, and the hard drive in here is also pretty old and crappy. Plus, this GPU really isn't suited to this computer at all. Part of the problem is that the spectrum of potential Windows XP hardware is so big and diverse, there are just so many other options that are going to be better than this computer. So while it could do Windows XP things, pretty much anything else would probably be better for that. I mean, even the lack of any USB 2.0 already is pretty annoying here. That's not to say it's all bad necessarily. If it had to be used for this purpose, it could probably work. I don't know I would use this media necessarily. And in fact, seeing this is gonna be too slow to reasonably browse the internet or run any modern software anyway, this probably would be far better off if this was running RTM Windows XP or Service Pack 1, as old as those versions are. To be clear, I'm not that surprised. This is about what I expected after all. It's workable, but it's just not meant for this computer.